Okay, so just a reminder, thank you for the reminder. Actually, next Tuesday is Town Hall Meeting Day, so we will not convene for lecture next Tuesday. However, Monday night, assignment 7 is due for the undergraduates, and written report number 2 is due for the graduate students. And undergrads, you can also move on to assignment 8 on Tuesday, and then we will all reconvene back here a week from now. And then we're on to spring recess. Okay, time flies. Any questions about assignment 7? Weekly reports, final projects, everything's going well? Okay, great. So we're going to finish off our lecture today, lecture 13 on modularity. And we've started in on this third theme of open problems in the field. And we're tackling this first one, which is this issue. Modularity is actually the solution to the problem, which is non-modularity. In most of the projects or most of the experiments you've seen so far, we're looking at robots that have neural networks, and more or less sort of every neuron is connected to lots of other neurons. We have this big ball of spaghetti, and what that basically means is that when evolution mutates any one synaptic weight, makes a change to the neural network, that change flows through to whatever motor neuron is nearby to that synapse. That motor moves differently than it did in the ancestor, which means the robot moves differently, which means the next time step, all of the sensor values are different, which means all the values flowing down the synapses are different, which means all the motor values at the next time step are different, and you get this cascading change by just from one mutation to one synapse. So instead of having everything connected up with everything else, can we modularize things? Can we create sort of independent pieces where mutations can play with one part of the neural network or one part of the robot's behavior and not really adversely affect other parts of its behavior? That's the solution, to modularize things. 2 options. We can try and modularize things ourselves. As investigators, we can go in and make it impose some modularity, but what's the problem with that approach?
We don't know what the robot can do.
We don't know necessarily what, if we make divisions, if those are going to be useful separations.
We don't know if those are the useful separations, right? It's hard for us to decide how to break this problem down for the robot, right? As always, thinking about thinking is misleading. So in the experiment that we're going to conclude in a moment, the investigators looked at both options. They tried to modularize the network themselves, but they also designed a neural network in which evolution could, if it was useful, come up with its own modules. Okay, we'll finish that and then we'll come back to, and we'll talk about lecture 14 in a moment when we get there. Okay, so just as a bit of a reminder for where we are, this is actually an older experiment. It was done back in the 90s with our trusty Kepra robot here. It's driving around on a tabletop or in simulation. They did all this work in simulation, as you can see at the top first. Had to pick up these little wooden cylinders and go to a wall of the arena and drop the cylinder over the edge of the arena. That's the task. And then they did this by looking at 5 different neural networks. So they evolved 5 different kinds of neural networks, going from simple to complex. Network A, sensors directly connected to motors. B, sensors, hidden neurons, motors. Network C, we have recurrent connections, so if memory is useful for this task, network A should do better than network B. And then they manually imposed modularity in network D by having these 2 separate neural circuits. One is in operation whenever the robot is holding an object, and the other network controls the motors when the robot is not holding one of the objects, right? So they've decided those are 2 good modules. The robot should do behavior A when holding the object, and it should do behavior B when it's not. Evolution, by tuning the synaptic weights of network D, can still determine what the robot does in these 2 modules, but they've imposed the modules themselves. And then we had this network E, which has in the back row there these selector neurons. And each pair of selector neurons, when the left value is greater than the right value, the left module is in charge, and when the right selector neuron has a greater value than the left selector neuron, the right neural circuit is in charge. Right? So by evolution tuning the synaptic weights that flow from the sensors to the back row, to the selector neurons, evolution can decide under what sensory conditions one neural circuit or the other is in control. And by tuning the synaptic weights that flow from the sensors to the front row, to the motor neurons, evolution can tune what those modules do when they're in charge of their respective motor, right? Left motor, right motor, the pickup behavior or the release behavior. Okay, so those are the 5 different networks, and as we saw last time, network E blew away the competition. So this is kind of nice, right? Because again, evolution is smarter than we are. Clearly, modularity is useful in this task. Otherwise, E and D wouldn't have done any better than networks A, B, and C. And network E clearly did better than network D. So evolution said, let me decide what the modules should be and what they should do. Don't you decide. Okay, they did all that in simulation, and then they also transferred it to the physical Kepler, still did better. Okay, we ended last time, I think, here, where we're just starting our analysis of what exactly one of these evolved E networks do. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but
No problem.
So E did way better than the other 4.
Correct.
So the data from on the bottom slide are from the physical robot.
This is the physical world. So this was in simulation. So they did a bunch of evolutionary trials with each of the 5 kinds of networks. I don't know how many exactly, but they did a few evolutionary runs with network A, then with B, then with C. And as usual, they're plotting the fitness of the robot in the simulated case.
So in the physical realm, D is the imposed
Modularity,
So
correct.
that seems almost like us tinkering with the robot's modularity is almost a hindrance. Because it doesn't do as well as even this B and C.
That's true. Now, they don't have error bars on here, so it's hard to say that D is worse than these. It looks like it,
Yeah.
but yeah, they're all doing pretty bad.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
It's also weird how the simulation, like, I would say B, C, and D, and E are all, B, C, D, and E are all very close.
That's true. They're very close at the end, right? So eventually B, C, and D catch up to E, but you can see out of the gate at the beginning, E blows the competition away, right? There's clearly some advantage.
When they make them into physical robots, are they measuring a different variable, or is there a different explanation for why?
I think, again, it's not 100% clear in the paper. What I think they did was to take evolved controllers from the end of evolution. So they took the best controllers they got at the end of evolution and dropped it into the physical robot and looked to see how well the physical robot did with the best controllers they could evolve in each of these 5 conditions.
So that's sort of like how it bridges the reality gap to some extent.
This is also about bridging the reality gap, which we're going to tackle next week, right? So not only did E do better in simulation, but those controllers, those E controllers, were more transferable. We squeezed more of the evolved behavior out of the physical robot than we could when we transferred over the BCD networks, right? Just kind of interesting. They didn't talk about that in the paper, but not only are they more fit, but they're more transferable. All good? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at just one evolved network like we did in the minimal cognition experiments. This is one evolved E network. And is there a correspondence between evolved modules and distal behavior? So distal means us, right? We're looking at a distance and we're going to try and identify behaviors. And I'm sort of giving away the punchline here. Very difficult to do. First of all, what were the actual modules? Well, evolution didn't make use of all the modules. It only used one. It said in the case of the right motor, from time to time, the selector neuron pair associated with the right neuron, those pair of neurons, their values would pass one another. Sometimes the left value would be higher than the right value, and then while the robot is behaving, sometimes the right value would become greater than the left value, which means the robot was switching between these 2 different neural modules for the right motor. Switching between this module and this module. In the other three groupings, the pair of selector neurons, the values never passed one another. So either the left value is always higher than the right value, or the right value is always higher than the left value. Evolution said, I don't need modules for the left motor pickup and release, just the right motor. So already it's kind of non-intuitive. Okay. The investigators then spent quite a bit of effort trying to understand what exactly the modularity was that evolution discovered in this particular run. Let's look at the simulation in the top left first. So what exactly did the robot do? Well, there were 5 of these objects in the arena. You can see the line here is tracing the trajectory of the robot, and over a period of time, the robot found 3 of the objects, picked each one up, took it to the edge of the arena, and dropped it outside of the arena. So you can see the 3 black cylinders are now outside the arena, and if you look carefully at this squiggly picture here, you can figure out where the Kepler robot went to and dropped it outside the arena. Okay, so it's not perfect. It didn't clean up the arena completely, but got 3 out of 5. Not bad. Okay, during that process, as it was finding these objects, picking them up, taking them to the edge, and dropping them outside, what was going on inside the controller of the robot? Okay, let's take this figure a little bit at a time. So in the top row here is mod. This is module. And what they're recording over the lifetime of this particular robot is how is the pair of selector neurons in the right motor switching. So when there's a gap, that means left selector neuron was greater than right selector neuron, and the left module was in charge. And when there is a black tick, that means that the value of the right selector neuron went higher than the left selector neuron, and suddenly the right neural module was in charge. You can see already that the pattern is pretty intermittent, right? It wasn't that there was some continuous period in which left was in charge and then right was in charge. It's kind of switching back and forth relatively quickly between these modules, which is already non-intuitive from a human point of view. We would expect behavioral modules to be something like do A for a while, stop, then do B for a while, stop, then go back to doing A. That's not what evolution does. It says modularity is useful, but I'm going to use modules in a way that's a little bit different than you might think about it. Okay, so now as we go through the second to the bottom row here, we're trying to play spot the similarity. We're going to compare the kth row to the top row, and we're looking to see what's going on under the hood of the robot that might correspond to or explain what these modules actually are. What is the left circuit doing? What is the right circuit doing? First thing they looked at is what is perceived, WT. So as the robot is moving around, is its proximity sensors pointing at a wall, or is there an object within its field of view, wall or target? So I'm not sure. Let's see, we can probably figure it out from this picture, which is which.
Wall would be the top one, I guess.
How so? How do you know?
Well, maybe. Because there's that long stripe after it's picked up. There's the LB, which is what that means that the light barrier is on. So that's picked something up already. And then there's a long stretch afterward where it might be, I don't know.
It's hard to tell, right? It could still be holding something. It could be holding something and looking at the wall or looking at another object. The point here is, again, it's not obvious from our point of view, right? So whatever it is, these modules do not correspond to, I'm looking at a wall, I'm going to go to the wall and drop what I'm holding over the far side. And I'm now looking at a target, I'm going to go find it and pick it up, right? Whatever these two modules are, it's not that. It doesn't correlate with what the robot is looking at, wall or target. Okay, that's not it. Left motor, right motor. Well, you can see that there is a bit of a correspondence between mod and RM, the right motor, which would make sense because the right motor is getting commands from the left neural module, and then the right one, left, right, and it's obviously switching what the right motor does. Does it spin quickly, which are these black ticks in LM and RM, or white indicates the wheel is slowed or stopped. So clearly switching between these modules is affecting the right motor.
Oh, the spin, you mean the rotational speed of
The rotational speed of the...
not turning the robot, okay.
Turning the wheel itself, right? That's what, that's the values that are arriving at RM is dictating the speed of RM. You'll notice also, though, that when RM, for example, is stuttering, so is the left motor. Why is that? It seems odd. Right? We're only switching the controller is only switching between the left and right module for the right motor. Why is the left motor being affected?
Maybe because it's in a search phase or search, trying to find something, I don't know.
Possibly. Think about the sort of millisecond to millisecond behavior of the robot during this period. The right wheel is speeding up and then coming to a stop. Speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, slowing down.
Well, they're both attached to the robot.
They're both attached to the robot. We're dealing with an embodied agent, right? Embodied cognition. So when one motor does something and affects the movement of the robot, all the other sensors are affected, right? If you're starting and stopping, the visual flow that's falling on your retina is changing quite a bit. So the sensors of the robot is changing, and the sensors influence the left motor. So you start to see some of that behavior as well. Some of it might actually be physical. This robot might be accelerating and decelerating quickly and actually pulling and pushing on the left wheel. That might also be affecting it, right? So the brain of this robot is modular to some degree, but the body, in another way, is not so modular. The movement of one motor affects the values of all the sensors at the next time step, which in turn affects all the motors. So we're going to look at modular robots towards in a couple weeks, actually. Modular robots have not only modular brains, but also modular bodies. They can move one of their modules and not affect the movement of other parts of their body. This is not a modular robot. Okay, pick up, PU and RL here, pick up and release. So you can see at this particular point that the pickup signal was triggered. Did the robot actually successfully pick up an object at that point in time? And how might we know?
It looks like it is, because if you go down to A, it says carrying an object looking for wall. It seems like those lines very much line up.
Exactly. And you can also tell it from LB, which is the light barrier. So right at this moment when it says pick up, the light barrier laser, which is this thing that's going between the two pincers of the robot's gripper, is broken. So there's something in there which is the object, right? So it successfully triggered the picking up of an object, and during this period, it's actually holding an object. And satisfyingly, we can see that there are 3 of these periods which correspond to the 3 time periods during which the robot was transporting one of the 3 objects. Okay. Do the modules in the top row correlate with when the robot is holding the object? Which would probably be the most obvious modular decomposition for us. Is module A in charge whenever it's not holding an object, and is module B in charge whenever it is holding an object?
Not really.
Not really, right? So if that were true, you would expect to see these bands down here being reflected in the top row. So evolution did not choose what to us would be the most obvious way to decompose this problem into modular sub-solutions.
More white space where it is carrying an object.
There's a little bit. Maybe it's not perfect, but there's some, right? Okay. Should we give up? Is there anything here in terms of the robot's behavior? Here are the values of the 6 infrared sensors. Here are the 7 other ways that you might, or 7 other ways you might modularly decompose this problem. Is there any correspondence here whatsoever?
Some of H, avoiding a wall, seems to line up pretty well with the ticks on mod.
H, yep, that's not bad. It's pretty close, right? So maybe it's got something to do with that, right? Maybe there is something to be learned here about what these modules actually are. Do you have an idea?
I think you might have already said this, but the A lines up with the light barrier.
The A lines up with the light barrier, that's right. So this is, the A through H, these are things that we as roboticists might say. So if I said, listen, break this problem down into 8 modules, sub-behaviors, and program those into the robot, you might choose something like this. And so A obviously corresponds with LB because this is showing us these are the periods during which the robot actually is holding the object, right? So they decided on A through H here, and then as the robot was doing its thing, they recorded when these 8 sub-behaviors were actually being exhibited.
Are those solid lines or are they series of dashes? I can't quite tell.
In which case?
Like if you look at C, for example, that first little tick, is that a series
I think
of
they may be
vertical
ticks,
lines?
but it's basically continuous, right?
Okay.
C, which is it sees something, is pretty much continuous throughout. Okay, I think Sage, yeah.
H with WT.
H with WT, again, that would make sense, right? Because H is, or not necessarily, H is avoiding a wall, and that's when it sees the wall or sees something else.
Do you get anything interesting if you sum them up?
Maybe, right?
A bunch of them.
Well, so it's like the infrared sensors, like they don't catch everything, but like, excuse me, if you sum them up.
If you
like-
sum them up, yeah, if you sort of look at all of the I rows as a whole and compare them to the top row, there's a bit of a correspondence there. So what that means is that one of the modules seems to be in charge more often when the infrared sensors are firing, generally speaking. When they're not firing, the other module is in control. It's not perfect, but more or less. Which does, in retrospect, start to make a little bit of sense, right? Basically, evolution is saying when you can't see anything, I want this module to control the right motor. And when you do see something, I want this other module to be in control of the right motor. Everybody else, all the other parts of the neural network, just do what you do. Kind of makes sense, right? It's almost starting to look like a Bratenberg vehicle. When you don't see something, turn or explore, and then when you see something, stop and go after it. More or less, not perfect. Right? Okay, so there's hope for us yet to be able to understand what evolution is doing in this case or in general. Okay, so like we saw again in the minimal cognition experiments, they took they took some of these evolved controllers and then they dropped it back into the robot and exposed the robot to novel conditions, things that the controller never saw during evolution. They did a total of 7,200 trials of novel things, and what did they do? Well, they took the robot, they put it at 20 different distances from either an object or the wall, so that they put it at a certain position, 20 of these different positions, and they set the robot down at 180 different orientations. So 180 times 20, and then for each of those, they did it with the robot holding an object and the robot not holding an object. 7,200 separate things. They then did this with A, B, C, D, and E. I don't know why C is not on this figure. Seems like they intentionally left it off, not sure why. Most of the time, for all 4 of the 5 networks, the networks did more or less what they were supposed to do, but there were still considerable errors, which you would expect, right? Evolution is not an optimizer, it doesn't produce a perfect solution, it's a satisficer. It produces something that satisfies what it's supposed to do in the situations where it's evolving, so it's sometimes gonna make mistakes when it's exposed to novel situations. But it looks like B and E, and certainly we usually want E to do the best here. E is making the fewest mistakes. So not only did E get high fitness during evolution, and the E controllers transferred well from the simulated to the physical robot, but it's also more robust. It's making fewer mistakes in new situations. Okay. So what does this look like? Well, let's take one evolved E controller, which you see in the top 4 panels, And let's start with the upper left panel here. So they took that E controller, put it in the robot. The robot had its gripper empty, and they placed it at a number of distances away from the wall, close to the wall, or far from the wall, and then either facing directly towards the wall, or with the wall on the robot's right, or with the wall on the robot's left, right? A whole bunch of these situations. So every pixel within this panel corresponds to one of these initial conditions. The robot is a certain distance from the wall, and it's got a certain angle relative to the wall. So far, so good? Okay. White pixel is what did the robot do when it was placed in that situation? And in the top left panel, in all of those situations, it did nothing. It didn't try and pick up the object, and it didn't try and release it, which is fine, which is what it should do, right? It's not holding anything. It can't see any object, so it shouldn't drop anything over the wall. Okay, they did exactly the same thing in the upper right panel here, but now they placed an object inside the robot's gripper, so it was already holding the object. What did the robot do in those situations? Most of the time the pixels are white. It wasn't doing anything.
Drop it over the edge when it's facing the wall.
It tried to drop it when it was facing the wall, which is these central columns in this picture, and when it was close enough to the wall, which are the lower rows in this panel, right? Most of the time, except for this little triangle in here, when it was right up against the wall and facing the wall and holding an object, and it didn't release it, right? Not very satisfying. That's exactly when you would want it to release the object. Let's go down to this panel. So now the robot is looking at a cylinder and its gripper is empty. What does the robot do in these cases? Again, most of the pixels are white, so it's not doing anything.
Well, it's the it's that tiny little triangle.
It's the tiny little triangle, right? So this robot is pretty fastidious, right? It says, I'm only going to try and grab this object when I'm right in front of it, right up against it, and I'm directly facing it. Then I will try and pick it up, right? So why, exactly, why is there this little black triangle here, and that black triangle is missing from the top right panel, where you would expect it to be a light gray triangle? Think about that particular situation. The robot is right up against something, which is either an object or the wall. It doesn't know what it is, right? All or most of its infrared sensors are firing, right? It's either facing a wall or facing an object. It's not quite sure. So it's very, very specific, right? So it probably gets right up against the object, and there is some very specific sensor signal that says, aha, this is an object. Lift it up, right? The rest of the time it says, I don't know, right? Okay. Cylinder and the gripper is full. This makes sense. So it's holding an object and it sees another object. It's doing the right thing. It should not release the object it's holding. Don't go after the other one because you're already holding one. So most of the time in the top four panels, the robot is doing the right thing. Okay, let's look at a second evolved controller down here, which again, top left panel, it's facing the wall or near a wall and its gripper is empty. It correctly does nothing.
How do you define the mistakes then? Because it seems like holding it over the edge and not releasing is a mistake, but it said...
It's in that condition, it's facing the wall, it's got the object over the wall, and it's not making a mistake because it might move and then it hits one of those gray pixel conditions and then drops the obstacle, right? So an error would be, for example, that it drops an object inside the arena and goes after another one. Okay, for example. Okay, so it's doing the right thing here. Same thing over here. When it's close enough to the wall and it's holding an object, it drops the object most of the time. Well done. Same thing over here. It's holding a cylinder. Its gripper is empty and it's near a cylinder, so it picks it up. But here, it makes a few mistakes. So now it's holding a cylinder, gripper is full, and it sees another cylinder, and sometimes when that other cylinder is close to it and just to its right, it triggers the release behavior. It drops the cylinder and perhaps goes after the other one. Hard to say. It makes a mistake here.
It's also interesting that the gripper full is shaded off to the left as well.
Possibly.
Opposite.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. So we definitely know that in these conditions, the robot is making a mistake. So let's go back to evolution. What was happening during evolution? And I want you to focus on this part of the figure, and I'll go back and forth here a little bit. What you're seeing in this picture, each black pixel here is a condition that the robot actually experienced during evolution. White pixels are situations that are theoretically possible, but the robot never experienced during evolution. Why is the robot making this mistake?
Because that thing down there is in the white region where it didn't get trained about that.
That's right. The gray triangle is in the white region here, which means the robot never saw that condition during evolution. There was never a situation during evolution where the robot was holding an object and it saw another object close up and on the right. Which situations the robot actually saw is up to evolution, right? It's the one that's tuning the neural network and getting the robot to do something. So this is, again, an open problem in evolutionary robotics. If we evolve flight control software for an airplane, and we say, in all the situations we tested this airplane, it works great, so go ahead and fly on this autonomous plane. You'll have no problems. If something happens that the plane has not experienced before during evolution, who knows? Okay, so an important problem. Okay, so to conclude our discussion here of modularity, and we're focusing, just as a reminder, we're focusing on structural modularity, connectivity within the neural network. We saw that evolution made a lot of decisions, and some interesting decisions. First of all, as always, evolution, by tuning the synaptic weights, determines what experiences the robot has over its lifetime. That's normal. That usually happens. What's new here is step number 2. By tuning the synaptic weights that go from the sensors to the selector neurons, evolution can decide whether a behavior is modularized or not. The particular situations, step number 3 here, the particular situations that, the particular sensory situations that determine when these modules switch is also under evolutionary control. So it's saying, let's modularize the problem, and I'm going to determine what situations trigger the use of these different modules. And then finally, when a module is in control of the motors, what does that module tell the motors to do as a function of sensors? And that's determined by tuning the synaptic weights of the synapses that go from the sensor neurons to the output neurons.
Figure E, is that just starting conditions, or is that it's moving around and it's saw? Because otherwise you'd expect to see more.
In this figure down here?
Yeah.
Sorry, repeat your question for me.
Are those just starting conditions? So those are all the points where they started the robot?
That's a good question. Are those just the initial conditions, or those are all that it saw? I think these are not just initial conditions, but everything the robot experienced.
Expect it to be a little more continuous then.
Possibly. It depends on how quickly it's able to move and the refresh rate.
Okay.
I'm not sure. It's a good question. Okay, so again, this is good news for us. We know that non-modularity is a big problem when we're trying to evolve these things. We would like them to be modular, but our intuition may break down, especially when we get up to more complex robots and more complex tasks. We may not have a good intuition about how to break the problem into bite-sized chunks. So let's let evolution figure it out, and this experiment demonstrates that at least in simple cases, it can do so. Okay, any questions about that? Yes?
So is the vehicle perfectly symmetrical?
Is the vehicle perfectly symmetrical? In simulation, yes. In reality, probably not, right? Pretty much, yes, but there are always going to be small asymmetries in the mechanical makeup of the robot.
So would you be surprised if over multiple, like simulations from initialization to having a final controller,
Mhm.
the right motor was chosen every time for modularity? 'Cause
Ah.
to me, it seems like there's a mirror case, and having asymmetry can be advantageous for evolution. So,
Could be.
like, it's reasonable to expect that to happen, but for the right motor to be chosen instead of the left,
left.
that seems arbitrary to me.
I agree. It seems arbitrary, and it's probably a result of historical accident, which occurs all the time in evolution, artificial evolution and biological evolution. Why are most of us right-handed rather than left-handed, right? If we were able to rerun the evolutionary tape, maybe most of us would be lefties and the minority would be righties, right? So there's nothing special about the right motor. That being said, there may be an asymmetry here somehow that it's useful to modularize one motor and not the other one. Who knows, right? But definitely the choice of right versus then left is probably arbitrary. Unfortunately, well, they only had so much time and so much space. It would be interesting to see what other modular solutions evolution came up with. If network E was so great, what other kinds of modular decompositions might be possible? There's probably lots that are helpful for this task, not just this one. Okay. Again, maybe an interesting idea to pursue in your final project. Okay, that concludes our discussion of modularity, and we're going to move on now to lecture 14. In lecture 14, we're going to look at a pair of algorithms, and these algorithms were designed to deal with a separate open problem in evolutionary robotics in particular, but in AI in general. And this problem is known as the competing conventions problem. We mentioned this, I think, when we talked about neural networks. And this little cartoon here illustrates the problem. Let's assume that we have these two networks here. We have two inputs and one output neuron in this neural network pair. And we've got three hidden neurons. Let's imagine that both of these neural networks have already been trained using evolution or using something else, so that the three hidden neurons are computing three separate subfunctions. If you remember back to our discussion on neural networks, we looked at a neural network that could compute the XOR function, and it did it using two hidden neurons. One hidden neuron computed the OR of the two inputs. The other hidden neuron computed the AND of the two input neurons, and then the output neuron combined the OR and the AND together to produce XOR. So the overall function was XOR, but the hidden neurons computed these two subfunctions. In our cartoon example here, it doesn't matter what these subfunctions are, but let's imagine that in order to solve this task, the neural network needs to compute three subfunctions, A, B, and C, and then combine them in the right way. Let's imagine further that this cartoon was taken at some snapshot partway through the training session, so partway through evolution, where these two networks in the population, they both are computing A, B, and C, but let's imagine they're not perfect. One of them does a little bit better at A than the other one, and the other one does a little bit better at B than the other one. They're not perfect. So we would like to try and combine these two together. So if the left one is doing well at A, and the right one is doing well at B, we'd like to be able to cut these things in parts and glue together the good A from parent 1 with the good B from parent 2, right? So we're now talking about cutting and combining. So we have now left mutation behind, and we're talking about the second greatest hack that Mother Nature ever came up with, which is sex, right? We're going to recombine genetic material from two parents, and if we're lucky, we combine the best of both worlds. Okay. So let's take these two networks, and we're going to cut the left one here. So we're going to divide AB from C in network 1. And we're going to cut this one, the second parent, in the same place. So we're going to take A, B here, and put them in the child here, A, B, and take the A from this third, we're going to take this third hidden neuron from the second parent and drop it in here. How did that cut do? We chose a place to cut, which was between the second and the third hidden neuron in these two parents, and glued the two parts together. How does this child do? Not very well. Why not?
It doesn't have a C.
It doesn't have C, right? So we've missed something in the cutting. Actually, this child will probably do worse than both parents. So that was not a good place to cut. So instead, let's cut, we're cutting the same place. And even if we combine C and B with C, so we're still cutting in the same place here. We're going to take C and B from this parent, drop it in here, and this C from this parent and drop it in here. It doesn't work. You can play this game forever if you like. You can try cutting here and here. Still doesn't work. So it's like if I took my Mac and I took one of your PCs, cut them in half, glued the two pieces together. That didn't work. We throw away those two computers. I take my second Mac and another PC and say, let's try and cut them in a different place, glue those two halves together. Also probably not going to work, right? Why doesn't it work? Because the guts of a computer for different computers have competing conventions. In one computer, the CPU is on the left side, and in the other computer, the CPU is on the right side. So both of these two networks are doing the right thing, but no one said that subfunction A has to be computed by the leftmost hidden neuron. That it could be anywhere. So these two networks have more or less the same semantics. They do more or less the same thing, but they have different syntax. Things are in different places. That's the competing conventions problem. Neural networks, when they're trained, if they're trained more or less independently, they have competing conventions, so we cannot combine neural networks together. Okay, that's the problem. How do we solve it? Well, a few years ago, Ken Stanley published a paper and introduced this algorithm called the NEAT algorithm. Kind of some nice branding there because it is a neat algorithm. It's kind of neat once you understand how it works. Here's how it works. We're going to be evolving neural networks, but instead of having a matrix in which each element of the matrix indicates a synaptic weight, we're instead going to have two lists, and the length of these lists can change. So the picture, the gray box that you see at the top, that's the entire genotype, specifies the blueprint for a phenotype, which is going to be a neural network. Okay, we have two lists. One contains information about the nodes or neurons, and the second list contains information about the connections or the synapses. So a neuron list and a synapse list. We have 5 neurons, as you see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3 of them are sensor neurons, 1 is a hidden neuron, and the 5th one is an output neuron. And then we have a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 synapses, and in each element of this list specifies parameters to describe a single synapse. First thing we need to know is what is the presynaptic neuron of this synapse and the postsynaptic neuron. Where does it start and where does it go to? And of course, its weight. There's then a flag, a binary flag that says whether this synapse is enabled or disabled. So if mutation changes enabled to disabled, that synapse disappears. And then there's this innovation number, and we'll come back to that in a moment. That's the heart of the NEAT algorithm. But we have this list, and if we take that genotype and we construct the phenotype from it, that's the network that we get. Make sense? Pretty straightforward. Okay. Okay, now what can we do with this genetic representation? Well, let's look at the top panel for a moment. Remember that each genotype has 2 lists, the neuron list and the synapse list. We're going to just ignore the neuron list for a moment. We're just going to look at the synapse list. So this particular network has 5 synapses in it. One of them is turned off, so you see only 4 of the 5 show up in the actual phenotype. So this is a silent gene, or junk DNA if you like. It's not read out into the phenotype at all. We're going to create some new mutation operators. So up till now, all of the mutation operators that we've seen basically select a synapse and change the weight of that synapse. In NEAT, we can add and remove synapses as well as change their weight. So let's imagine we take this particular genome and we mutate it by adding a connection onto it. We add a new connection that connects neuron 3 to neuron 4, indicated by the red line there. And we added this innovation number 7. Okay, so what is the innovation number? It's basically a historical marking. So every time we create some new genetic material in the entire population, we have a global counter. So in this cartoon example here, the global counter is sitting at 7. We've created a new synapse, so we assign 7 to that synapse. We increase the global counter to 8. And now maybe another network in the population is mutated, and that new network gets a new synapse. It gets an innovation number of 8. We're basically just tagging things with unique IDs as evolution creates them. Okay, so why are we doing that? We'll talk about that in a moment. Why would we want to do that? First of all, let's talk about other things we can do. So we can add synapses. We can remove them by, or evolution can remove them by flipping the enabled flag to disabled. And we can also add neurons. So again, I'm only showing you the synapse list here, but there is also the neuron list. So imagine that evolution randomly chooses to add a neuron to this particular network in the bottom left. It adds a neuron to the neuron list, assigns the global counter value to it, increments the global counter. And because it's added this neuron, it also tends to add 2 additional synapses so that it wires that new neuron into the network. If you just add a neuron and there's no synapses arriving at it or leaving from it, it doesn't do anything, right? So evolution, randomly wires up 3 to 6, which is the new neuron, and 6 to 5. And when they added those 2 new synapses, they also used the global counter to assign unique IDs to those synapses. So far, so good? Okay, so now we have an evolutionary algorithm where evolution can add, modify, and remove synapses, and add, modify, and remove synapses. Okay. Now for the magic, right? We want to be able to cut a Mac in half and a PC in half and glue the 2 halves together and get a functioning computer that's better than either of the 2 original computers. How do we do this? Okay, let's take 2 neural networks. You'll notice these neural networks have different topologies, or different cognitive architectures, right? Different collections of neurons and synapses. So they probably have different semantics. So in the left parent, there is a hidden neuron with global counter 4, and this one has 4 and 6 in there. And we're going to try and combine them. But you'll already notice something interesting. I mentioned that this global counter assigns unique IDs to each newly created neuron or synapse. But we now have 2 parents, and in both of those parents, there is a neuron that has the same number associated with it, the same innovation number. How is that possible?
They're reusing some.
They're reusing. These 2 neural networks have the same genetic material in them. They both have neuron 4. How is that possible? I just told you that when evolution adds a neuron to mutates a network by adding a neuron to it, it assigns a global count. It assigns the global counter value to that neuron, in this case, the value 4, and then updates the global counter to 5. How did both of them end up with a neuron with the innovation number of 4?
Well, if you have 2 robots, or two neural networks rather, and that has a certain structure, and then you mutate them separately, they have a lot of the same information. They've just been mutated and changed a little bit, and then if you then bring those back together,
Absolutely, right? So these two parents must have had an ancestor, and that ancestor was the one that received this brand new neuron with an innovation number of 4. The ancestor did. That ancestor, let's imagine that it was actually the parent of these two parents, so the grandparent if you want. That grandparent produced 2 separate offspring, these 2 networks that you see here, and they both inherited the same neuron from their grandparent, neuron number 4. So what this innovation number is actually doing, as I mentioned, it's a historical marker. It's tagging or indicating parts of the genome that have the common descent, right? We each have different eye color, but we all have a gene, and that gene somehow codes for eye color. And that comes from, if we go back far enough, our common ancestor, which had that gene to begin with. So we've all inherited a gene for eye color. And that particular gene may have picked up mutations along the way, so that we have slightly different values or different encodings in that gene, but we share that gene. The value or the alleles of that gene might be slightly different. Same thing here. Right? What can you tell me about the semantics of neuron 4 in these two parents? So when I say semantics, this is like the subfunction, or and in the XOR example we saw a few weeks back. Is the semantics of this neuron 4 going to be the same in both parents, similar, completely different? What do you think?
The same because they're both disabled.
They're the same because?
They're both disabled.
They are both, I'm sorry, this is a little confusing. So we're looking in the top here, these are the synapses that we're looking at here. And these are the innovation numbers for the synapses. There's a separate, I should have mentioned this, I'm sorry. There's a separate global counter for the neurons, one for neurons and one for synapses. So forget the disabled number 4 at the top. That's for synapses. Yes?
They're both the same because one is being passed to 4, 2 is being passed to 4, and 3 is being passed to 4.
Say that again? Okay.
Well, in each case, one is skipping 6, going straight to 4, and 2 is going to 4.
There, you're reading it right. So the numbers associated with the neurons, that's their innovation number. So we can see in the left parent that neuron 4 receives input from neuron 1 and 2 and passes its result on to neuron 5. And it's not quite the same in the right parent, but like in both cases, 4 receives input from 2. 4 also receives input from 1, but in the case of parent 2, it's also going through 6, so slightly different. And 4 is passing on its value to 5. That's the same in both parents. So it seems to be doing something slightly different, just by looking at this picture, but also something sort of similar, right? So again, like us, we all have genes. We have the same gene, a gene for eye color, and how that gene encodes eye color is slightly different in all of us. So similar, but maybe not identical and not completely different. So, but the fact that number 4 is derived from the same common ancestor means that neuron 4 in both parents is probably computing a very similar function. That means that we want to make sure that when we try and cross these parents in a moment, that we don't put 2 copies of 4 in one child and 0 copies of 4 in the second child. We want to make sure that we get 1 and only 1 copy of 4 in both children, right? Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we're going to take the 2 synapse lists from the parents. Again, you do the same thing for the neurons, but let's just focus on the synapse list for a moment. So we have 2 lists. As you can see, they're lists of different length. So we're going to try and line them up, and we're going to line them up, and as we do, we're going to stagger the lists or move the elements about so that we line up synapses that have the same historical marking. So we have synapse number 1 that shows up in both children. It shows up in both parents. In parent 1, it's enabled. In parent 2, it's disabled. But we know synapse 1 was derived from the same common ancestor. So synapse 1, if you were to look at the actual weight of it, probably pretty close. Similar, but not completely different. Both parents have a copy of synapse 2. Parent 2 has this synapse 3 that doesn't exist in the other parent, so we'll just leave that space blank in parent 1. Line up 4. Parent 1 has 5, but parent 2 doesn't, so we'll leave a little blank there. Line up 6. And parent 2 has these 2 additional or excess genes, 7 and 8. Okay, so we've lined up the genetic material from both parents, and we've gone through all this effort. So the last step, super easy. We're going to walk from the left to the right, and at every point, we're going, if there are 2 copies, flip a coin, if it's heads, take the copy from parent 1. If it's tails, take the copy from parent 2.
So the way this works, you're only ever going to end up with either 0 or 1 instance of a particular innovation over in a genome.
Exactly. So if you look at the resulting child we get down here, it has 0 or 1 copy of every unique piece of genetic material in the parents, right? There is no synapse, there's no pair of synapses that has the same number, right? If you are the result of 2 parents, and those 2 parents have some genetic material that they both inherited from an ancestor, the child should only get 1 copy of that. That is a very important lesson that we have learned from biological genetics. If a child organism inherits genetic material, 2 copies of genetic material from the same parent, you're in trouble, right? Take 1 from both parents.
So over time, with the number of synapses, it seems like the neural network would just increasingly grow very large.
That is a very good observation. So the child network, as you can see, is larger than either parents, and that's exactly what happens in this algorithm. And there have been a lot of papers since this paper was published that discuss that issue. That's okay. I mean, maybe we do want these networks to become more and more complex, but we don't want them to be overly complex. We talked about the trap of over-specialization when we were discussing neural networks. We don't want them to be too big because then they start to memorize rather than generalize. So the way this is usually handled is in the NEAT algorithm. They usually start with very, very simple neural networks and then do this very gradually and let the neural networks complexify. People are still working on ways to basically tamp down the complexity. How do we sort of slow evolution to say, listen, you make the networks better, but don't always make them bigger. That is still an open problem in the field, which we're not going to talk about in this class, but there's a lot of interesting work going on about that. That's a good observation. Okay, so we now have a child network that looks similar but not identical to its parents. We've cut the Mac and the PC in half and glued the 2 halves together. And amazingly, a lot of the time, not every time, but quite a bit of the time, the child gets a higher fitness than either of the parents. It outcompetes both parents. We successfully combine the best of both worlds by ensuring we take only 1 piece from both parents. We don't overlap semantically similar pieces that have the same common ancestor. Okay. There's a lot of amazing work where NEAT is used. We talked about all this, that's fine.
What you're saying is take the trackpad from the Mac and not the PC.
Take the trackpad if you're a fan of trackpads. Okay, yes, exactly. Best of both worlds. Okay, that's the NEAT algorithm. That has become a pretty common methodology that's used in a lot of areas now for practical applications. The author of the NEAT algorithm, Ken Stanley, he now runs the AI labs at Uber. Uber bought out Ken and a bunch of his colleagues, and they've now internalized a lot of this AI. This is, although an old algorithm, it's still more or less the state of the art. There's some bells and whistles that have been added on top, but this is sort of one of the things we've been trying to do in evolutionary computation for a long time, right? Evolve things, allow mutation to improve things independently, but every once in a while try and consolidate or combine useful evolutionary innovations from different parts of the family tree. Okay. So that's neat. We're now going to switch and start talking about HyperNEAT, which, as you can guess from the name, is built on top of the NEAT algorithm. So let's talk about HyperNEAT, and just remember, as we continue our discussion about HyperNEAT, in the factory floor, the bottom level of this algorithm, there's going to be a population of neural networks. Those neural networks are going to have different form, and we're going to evolve those networks to do something. What do those neural networks look like? Well, they are a particular kind of neural network called CPPNs. Again, I apologize for all the acronyms. We've seen CTRNNs before. CPPNs are quite different. Here's a picture of a CPPN on the left here. It's familiar to you in the way that we have an input layer, we have an output layer, and between the input and output layer, we have a bunch of nodes, which are neurons, and arrows, which are synapses that connect presynaptic neurons to postsynaptic neurons. What's novel, the new piece in CPPNs, is what's inside the neurons. Synapses are the same as we've always seen. Inside a CPPN neuron is a function, and I've visualized some of these functions here. That function is the activation function. We've actually already talked about them, right? So for example, let's see, we don't see any familiar ones here. The activation function, as you'll remember, takes the raw sum of the values arriving at the neuron, and that becomes the x value here in our little function, takes that x value and transforms it using the function into a y value, and the y value is the actual value that the neuron sends out along its outgoing synapses. Okay. In a CPPN, the activation functions inside the neurons can be all different from one another. In all the neural networks we've seen before, we usually decide. We say, okay, we're going to use the sigmoid function. Every neuron gets a sigmoid function, and we're done. Okay. Why would we do this? Why would we put different activation functions inside these networks? Well, when we do, we create a neural network which is now composing different functions together. So remembering back to high school or maybe first year university, we can compose a function, we can apply a function to a vector or a value, and then the result of that function we supply to another function, right? So what are we seeing up here? We're taking our two input neurons, X and Y. We feed them into the first neuron, which is maybe G, that receives value from them. And then this neuron, which receives a value from that neuron, is computing a function of this transformed signal, right? So that's where the C in CPPNs comes from. We're going to do some composition here. What do they mean by pattern producing? In HyperNEAT, we're going to do something a little bit odd. We're going to take as input, not sensor values, but we're going to take positions. That's why it's X and Y. We're going to scan over a particular space. And in this cartoon example here, we're going to start with a two-dimensional space or a two-dimensional plane. We're going to start by visiting the top leftmost pixel in this plane. Take that coordinate value, x equals 0, y equals 0, and pass those two numbers into the input of the CPPN. And the CPPN is going to spit out a single number, and that number is going to be used to paint that pixel, that position. So we're going to basically input to this network the position of each pixel in turn, and it's going to give us back paint, something that we're going to apply to that pixel. So in this cartoon example here, I have a colored image here. So let's imagine that this CPPN actually has three outputs, R, G, and B. So every time we feed in a coordinate, we get back R, G, and B values, which is a color, and we just colorize that pixel. Okay, before we talk about our friend the fly here, let's actually make some CPPNs and go through this by hand to see what this looks like. So let's take our two-dimensional plane here. We've got X and Y, and this is going to range between 0 and 1. Same thing for Y over here, between 0 and 1. And let's create, let's make a CPPN. So we have X and we have Y, and let's feed this into a single neuron which has the identity activation function. We're going to pass that out, and we're going to have a single output neuron, which is, I've got white chalk, so let's call this W, the amount of white chalk I'm going to supply at a given position. And let's connect just the X input to the neuron. We're not even going to wire up the Y input neuron. Let's start by supplying X equals 0 and Y equals 0. What arrives at W? I'm sorry, let's put some synaptic weights here. Let's put weights of 1. Make this really, really simple.
0.
0 times 1, put that through the identity, gives us 0. 0 times 1 gives us 0. This pixel gets no white chalk whatsoever. Let's go to X equals 0.1 and Y equals 0. How much white should we put here?
1.
0.1 times 1 is 0.1. 0.1 times 1 is 0.1. So a little bit of white chalk. Okay, I won't do the remaining 8 pixels here, but what is the pattern that this CPPN is going to paint along the lowest row of this picture?
It's gonna get darker as you go towards one.
Darker. It's going to
More
become
white.
more white, right? Okay, so we've painted all the pixels in this row. Let's go to this row now. X equals 0 and Y equals 0.1. What is the pattern that the CPPN is going to paint along this row?
It's gonna be the same because you aren't doing anything with the Y.
Right? Y is not wired up, so it has no effect. So we get a horizontal gradient in the amount of white, right? So instead of a whole bunch of different random values appearing, we get a particular pattern, and in this case, the pattern is a gradient, and this gradient is a horizontal gradient. So CPPNs, just by wiring them up, they tend to produce patterns, not random patterns, but patterns that have certain kinds of regularity in them. This is a fun game to play on your own, which is create a CPPN and see if you can figure out what pattern it produces. What is this CPPN? What pattern does this CPPN produce?
Vertical gradient.
A vertical gradient, right? We get more and more white as we go up this way. What about this CPPN? An angle, right? We get more and more white as we move up and to the right. Okay, that's just with one hidden neuron, or one hidden neuron. What happens if I change the activation function to this? Now what pattern do you get? Imagine this is X equals 0 and this is X equals 1.
Dot in the middle.
You get a dot in the middle, and you get this sort of Gaussian falling away in white as you move towards the edges of this picture, right? Okay, now we can understand our little insect here on the right-hand side. By creating random CPPNs, even before we do any evolution, just create CPPNs at random, they tend to produce non-random patterns. You don't get white noise on the right-hand side. You get things like gradients that we just saw. You get Gaussian patterns, certain patterns where there's a lot of ink and then it falls off. If you use trigonometric functions like sine and cos, you tend to get regular structures like you see in nature, segments of an organism. You get symmetries. So here we have bilateral symmetry. And you also get, from the same CPPN, you can also get it to paint very specific structures at particular places in the picture. Okay, so what HyperNEAT does is bias search towards non-random patterns. We can create random CPPNs and get things that have regularity. And that's good, because that's what biological development does. When we grow from single cells, it's not random growth. There are certain bias patterns that arise just because we're growing from one cell into a ball of cells, eventually into an adult human. So Mother Nature tends to bias her search of all possible shapes, the morphospace. We talked about this last week, right? We tend to get random patterns, right? We tend not to see organisms that are random collections of different kinds of cells. Okay, we got 5 minutes left, so let's just do a little bit of brainstorming about HyperNEAT to make sure we understand the intuition of these. I showed you a monochromatic version of HyperNEAT, right, where we have one output that's dropping the amount of white. We could add 2 more output neurons, R, G, and B, and then we could paint color. What if I wanted, instead of painting a pattern in 2-dimensional space, I wanted to paint a pattern inside a 3-dimensional space, inside a cube? So now we're going to colorize voxels rather than pixels. So the phenotype is now going to be a pattern in 3-dimensional space. My genotype is my CPPN. What change do you have to make to a CPPN to get it to paint in 3 dimensions?
Give it 3 as an input.
Give it Z. So now we have a CPPN that has 3 inputs, X, Y, and Z, and it will paint pictures inside 3-dimensional space. Next time, we won't get there yet, we're going to see a CPPN that paints patterns inside a 4-dimensional space, which again I can't draw, but you get the idea. Here we see a CPPN painting a picture. Let's imagine that we wanted it to paint a video for us. So a 2-dimensional picture that changes over time. How would you change a CPPN so that it'll create a video for you rather than an image? Add time as an input. So now we would have X, Y, T, right? So every time we increase T, it's going to influence the values arriving at the output neuron for all of the pixels at that time instant. We're going to get a picture that changes from one time step to the next. You can see how this becomes a very powerful tool for creating things, images, video. People have used it to create music, so paint notes onto a sheet of music. You can use it to create all sorts of things. So maybe since we have a few minutes here, I'll start by introducing this idea. Okay, we just talked about that. Oh, one last thing I want to tell you is, again, remember that we have NEAT, which is creating these CPPNs. So NEAT is creating and crossing CPPNs. And HyperNEAT is this process of taking a single CPPN and turning it into a regular pattern in some arbitrary dimensional space. Okay, I'm just going to plant the seed of this idea and we'll finish it off next time. In a much more recent paper, Clune and his colleagues created yet another neural network that looks like this. And this is a neural network that controls a robot. I'll show you the robot here. It's a quadrupedal robot, not unlike what we've seen so far. Oops. Okay, so we have a 4-legged robot. Each leg has actually 3 degrees of freedom, 2 at the shoulder and 1 at the knee. It's pretty energetic, this robot. Okay, so as you can see, this neural network is embedded in 3-dimensional space. We have 3 sheets. The front sheet here embeds sensor neurons. The middle sheet embeds hidden neurons, and the back sheet embeds output neurons. If we look at the sensor neurons, we have 4 rows corresponding to the 4 legs. The left-hand column represents input from the proprioceptive sensor for the forward-back hip joint. So this particular input neuron here receives the angle of the forward-back hip joint for the 4th leg, this one for the 3rd leg, and so on. These 4 sensor neurons here receive the 4 input inward and outward swinging joints at the 4 hips.
Why are there 5 circles?
Why are there 5 circles?
So there's 4 rows, but...
There's 4 rows, so we've got the hip, forward and back hip joints, inward and outward hip joints. We have the proprioceptive sensors at the knees, the 4 proprioceptive sensors at the knees. We then have touch information, so we have 4 touch sensors, 1 in each of the feet. And then we have 4 additional sensor neurons here. One that records the total amount of pitch, yaw, and roll. And finally, an input neuron that outputs a sinusoidal pattern, a regular sinusoidal pattern that just continues regardless of what the rest of the network is doing. What is this neuron? What kind of neuron is this? It's a CPG, right? Okay, we'll continue this discussion next Thursday. Have a good rest of your day.